Hello everyone, and welcome to a session from Tech Day 2015 titled Making Your Design Shine. I'm Brandon Adkins, Application Engineer with Quest Integration, and I'm going to lead you through this web session today about technical documentation and communication of your engineering design. On the agenda, we've got a couple of software tools to discuss that are going to help us leverage our design from engineering in multiple different ways, whether it be for sales, marketing, quality assurance, technical documentation. There are a lot of tools now in SolidWorks that will help us to be able to leverage the design and make very professional, easy to use technical communication data. So we're going to talk about SolidWorks Composer and PhotoView 360 to help us achieve some of those goals for reusing our engineering design. When it comes to technical documentation and communicating our design, much of the consumable data that gets created can be used in a variety of different ways. It can be used either in-house if you need assembly or maintenance instructions for your manufacturing crew to be able to assemble your design or what have you. But it can also be used for customer consumables if they need assembly instructions, maintenance instructions, if they need to be able to order parts from you. You might have a parts list included and maybe some detail views to help them get a better understanding of some of the detailed components of your design. Much of the documentation that we just discussed was handled in a two-dimensional format like we see with this manufacturing drawing. Many of those pieces of consumable data were handled in that two-dimensional type format for assembly instructions, maintenance manuals, what have you. We have tools today like PhotoView 360 and SolidWorks Composer to help us leverage the 3D CAD data and make something that's professional, easy to understand, and we can provide to our manufacturing group or customer base if we need to give them some information about the products. So when we get into SolidWorks Composer today, we're going to talk about creating some instructional information. I'll show you some quick tips for creating video instructions for maintenance and assembly. We'll also talk about creating static images and how to incorporate design changes from engineering. And that information can be used in a variety of different ways, like I mentioned. If it's for sales and marketing, we might need some rendered images, maybe some bill of materials information. That's all information that can be provided from SolidWorks Composer. Here's an example of something that we will be creating throughout the demonstration. We're going to talk about creating instruction manuals. Here's an example of that just in a Word document. The design that we'll be working with today, as you can see up in the top right corner of this slide, if you've watched any of the other web sessions from Tech Day, this is the same remote controlled quadcopter. We're going to be working on some instruction manual type of documentation for this. So we'll get into that. We'll also create some instructional information in a video format. Now this is a video that we created for last year's Tech Day session. This assembly is courtesy of Metal Roll Forming Systems. We created this video instruction in SolidWorks Composer to help users understand how the product, this coil reel, is supposed to be used in its everyday functions. So this involves loading the metal coils onto the reel. It shows the assembly and operation. Really it helps the end user to get a very good understanding of the product without having a lot of documentation really to go along with it. Video format is one of the easiest to understand. Here's another example of instructional video. This is courtesy of one of our customers, Nelson Irrigation. This video was created to help their end users understand the products that they design. So you can see that operation is shown for some of the components here. You can see that they've also included instructions for how to change some of the parts in this assembly. And that might involve just changing positions of those components. It might involve changing colors or different visual effects of some of the components in your assembly. And that can be pretty easily done in SolidWorks Composer like we see here. This particular video was created with a combination of different tools. SolidWorks Composer created a bulk of the animation effects, and it was also combined with Adobe After Effects to add some additional capabilities to the animation. But really a very good instructional video, nice professional looking images to help their end users understand how to use their product. So now that we've taken a look at some examples, let's go ahead and get into demonstration of how we might create some of that instructional information. So we're going to start here with our quadcopter design, and I'm going to begin actually with the animation portion in creating our instructional information. So let's start first with the partial animation that I've already set up here. I'll go ahead and just play through some of the animation so you can get a feel for what's been done so far. We're going to focus on maintenance here. We need to change out the bushings underneath that camera mount plate that you just saw disappear. Those bushings are the next item on the list that we need to control with our animation. So we're going to be adding these keyframes like you see down here on our timeline. Those keyframes are pretty simple to manage, and I'll show you some quick tips as far as creating that information and making sure that you're able to manage it very easily. The first thing that I want to do is make sure that those bushings hold their position up to a specific point in time. So I'm going to use a location key on the timeline to make sure that they hold their positions up until 9 seconds. At about 9.5 seconds, I'm going to use the transformation tools to move those bushings away from the rest of the assembly. And then a half a second later, we're going to take a couple of those bushings. We're going to move them to a different position. And a half a second later, we're going to take the other two bushings and also move those away from the assembly. So let's go ahead and play through what we've done so far. In a couple of quick steps, we created a simple exploded animation to remove those 4 bushings from the assembly. What I want to do next is convey to the end user that they're supposed to replace those bushings with a new part. An easy way, like you saw in the example video earlier, is to change the color of those components. The first thing I want to do, though, is capture the opacity properties of those bushings. I want them to stay fully opaque up until about 10.5 seconds or so. So we'll go ahead and record a property key for those bushings. Now you can see I've selected the opacity property, I've selected the 4 bushings, and I'm going to use the set keys option to make sure and record the opacity for those bushings. We're going to say maybe a half a second or so later, let's go ahead and fade those bushings out. We're just going to slide the opacity down to 0. Now that we've done that, let's talk about changing the color. We don't need a lot of time on our timeline to do this, so I'm going to give it maybe a fraction of a second here. I'm going to select the color because I've still got those bushings selected. I can record the properties of those selected actors. We're going to set the keys for the color, and a fraction of a second later we're going to go ahead and change the color for those actors. So I'll select from the quick palette here, change that color to red, and then maybe a half a second or so later, let's go ahead and change the opacity for those selected actors. Pretty simple to do. We've done quite a bit so far with this animation, so let's just play through those last few steps. We created exploded steps for the bushings. We fade the bushings out, replace them with the new red bushings, and now we just need to deal with putting those components back in place. Now I could go through and create individual steps to place the components back where they're supposed to go, but I already have steps that move them from their original position to their exploded position. So what we're going to do is take advantage of a quick tip here in SolidWorks Composer to help me leverage the steps I've already created and play them in reverse order. So you can see the bushings get to their final position there at 10.5 seconds. So what I'm going to do is copy everything from 10.5 seconds all the way back to the beginning of the animation. And just by holding down the control key, I can click and drag this black bar at the bottom of my timeline and place all of those keys in a separate location on the timeline. It's also important that I reverse the order of those keys that we just copied. So I'm going to leave those items selected. Simply right-click inside the selection box and choose Invert Time Selection. So what that will allow me to do is play all those keys in reverse order. Let's go ahead and play from this point forward. So you can see our bushings move back, there's our camera mount plate comes back, our fasteners get put back in place, the camera, and then the body cover. Everything looks good. The only issue I have with that is that the color of those bushings on a few of them has changed back to gray. The reason for that has to do with some of the keys at the beginning of my animation. We're recording the color property, which was gray in the beginning. So what I'm going to do is take advantage of some of the organization tools on my animation timeline. I'm going to select those 4 bushings. I'm going to set the timeline to only show keys for selected actors. And I'm also going to show keys only for the color property. So I'm going to start by selecting that color property and then choose to show only selected properties. Let's browse down to the end of our animation. You can see that right at about 23.5 seconds we have a key that changes the color for those selected actors. Let's go ahead and delete it. By deleting that key, we've actually told the animation to keep that same red color for all 4 of those bushings throughout the rest of the animation. So that allows me to get exactly the behavior that I want. Let's go ahead and play through what we have so far. So you can see all the explode and collapse steps. We're going to go ahead and go through just to make sure everything's working properly. Color changes on those bushings so the user knows to replace those with the red bushings and they know exactly how to put the parts back together. And it took almost no time at all to create those exploded steps. Very simple, very easy to manage here in Composer. What we'll take a look at next are some other shortcuts to help us add some additional information to this animation. For example, if I want to show, as those fasteners are being exploded early on in the animation, that there is an explode line to go along with these, this will help me clearly illustrate where those fasteners are originally located in the assembly. We can simply add from the Author tab an associative path based on the animation steps. So pretty simple to do here. Just go ahead and select our fasteners, create the associative path, and the animation is going to do the rest of the work for me. We can see those explode lines show in our animation there. Let's make this a little bit easier. We're going to click out in space to deselect all items. And you can see at about 6.5 seconds the fasteners disappear, but we haven't done anything to change the opacity of these explode lines. Let's go ahead and do that now. At 6.5 seconds, we're going to say that at the same time those fasteners disappear, we want to do the same thing with the explode lines. And I can do this very simply using the effects from my animation timeline toolbar. Click on the drop-down list and choose Fade Out. This will take care of the rest of the steps for me automatically. So as we play through those last couple of steps, we can see that the fasteners begin moving. Those exploded lines are created for us. And just when the fasteners themselves fade out, so do the explode lines. Gives me exactly the behavior I'm looking for. Let's go ahead and add some additional information to this animation. Let's say that just before we begin moving those cap screws, we're going to want to place an image to show what kind of tool would get used to create, or rather remove, those fasteners from the assembly. Okay? When I do this, I'm going to say that I want those fasteners to hold position just a little bit longer. Using the Control key, I'm going to copy the existing key there at 5 seconds, which will hold my fasteners in place for another ½ second. I can also add some additional time in between those steps simply by using the scale function on my timeline. So I select a section of the timeline, and then I can use this scale tool to add some time in between those existing keyframes. So we're going to give it another couple of seconds here. And that gives me some space to work with now on my timeline before those fasteners begin moving. Now in between that time, let's say at about 5.5 seconds or so, we want that image to show up of what type of tool to use to remove those fasteners. I'm going to take advantage of the existing workshops in the image library for Composer. We're going to use the image of a screwdriver to unscrew. Now you could use a variety of different images. You could even use solid models if you had a particular tool that you wanted to use here in this animation. I'll just use this simple 2D image of the unscrew function. We're also going to use an attachment type to show a leader on that image. So for the attachment type, we'll use this arc tooltip, and we'll use that tooltip. We'll go ahead and just attach it right close to that cap screw that we're interested in. Now what I want to do is actually fade that image out before the screws begin moving. So let's say at about 7 seconds we want that image to fade out. We'll come right back to that same drop down list, choose fade out, and let's play through our animation. So our image shows up right at around 5.5 seconds, sticks around for a bit, and then it's going to fade out at about 7 seconds, where we begin moving those fasteners and showing the rest of our explode steps. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about how to create a nice interactive type of animation to show assembly steps, maintenance instructions. It's very simple to understand, and I really don't need any words to explain what I'm trying to achieve with this assembly. So now that we've completed the instructional steps here in a video format, we're also going to talk about a traditional format that we might use to convey some of these steps that we've done in the animation. So we're going to switch back to our view mode to create static images. And you can see that a lot of these images have already been created for us. In that instruction manual that I showed you inside Microsoft Word, these images are just being leveraged in different places throughout that Word document. But what happens if we have a change to the engineering design? Let's say for this example that we're going to change this from a 2-propeller design to a 4-blade propeller design. That's as simple as going back to our SolidWorks assembly and choosing to update with the new version. So back in the location where we've stored that SolidWorks assembly, we're simply going to select the assembly. We're going to choose the options that will help us to import all of our parts individually the way that we want them. And you can customize these to fit whatever you need. And we can also choose any configuration that's stored within that SolidWorks assembly. So in this case, we're going to choose the 4-blade design that was updated by engineering. We'll go ahead and choose Update, and you can see that it'll go through a conversion process to help me bring in the new geometry from that SolidWorks assembly. And we do have some items to address here. We've got some new parts that are now part of our assembly tree. So we're going to search for those new parts. I'm going to go ahead and search for all the items called 4-blade. We're going to go ahead and show those items. And I'm also going to update the existing static images with those selected items. So anywhere I want those 4-blade propellers to show up, I'm simply going to select those existing views. I just held down the Shift key there to click all those views, and I'll hold the Control key to collect this last view. And I'm going to use the shortcut here to update all views with selected actors. Any views that I've selected are now going to include any actors that were selected in the viewport. So let's go ahead and cycle through these views. We can see now that our cover image is updated. If you need to change the position or anything like that, simple to do just with the mouse wheel. We'll go ahead and update our view. We've got a couple others here that we might use for other documentation, like exploded views. We've got some that use collaborative actors like arrows to show positioning of components. And what I need to do at this point is export the new version of my images that would get used in my Microsoft Word document. And I have some different options here from my high-resolution image workshop. I can remove the background, choose a white background if I like, and I can choose to save multiple views at one time if I need to export everything at once. Let's go ahead and do that in this case. I'll save all my images here. I'm just going to write them to the existing location for the manual images here. Now that we've got our new views exported, typically what you'll see in a demonstration like this where we update those owner's manuals with different images, you might see the images update automatically. I do want to show you how easy it is to create those image links inside Microsoft Word. So if you're not familiar with it, we do have the ability to link directly to those images. So if I were to ever overwrite the old image with a new version, the image can update automatically. The way that we're going to do that is simply by browsing to our image. So I'll go ahead and choose my cover image in this case. And we're going to choose the drop-down list here to insert and link to that file. Now my Word document understands where that image is located. If the image is ever to change, I can update my documentation automatically. And that's what's really going to help us to save a lot of steps when we create the newest version of our technical documentation. Let's go ahead and save our changes here. And that gives us some ideas to move forward with creating our technical documentation in a traditional format like an instruction manual that may get printed out and sent with the product that we've created. So far we've done some nice work to help us leverage our engineering design in SolidWorks Composer for a three-dimensional format as well as static images. What we're going to jump into next is creating some rendered images with PhotoView 360. If you need to leverage your SolidWorks assembly in other areas like sales, marketing, maybe web development, we can use those rendered images that come from PhotoView 360 to create some nice professional looking data. There are some tips that I'm going to offer to you in terms of creating an efficient rendered image from PhotoView 360. There are a lot of different options that you can use to experiment with, which include lighting. You can change environments and background settings, part appearances. I'm going to go ahead and show you some productive tools to help me manage that information very quickly. A couple of things that I'll mention before we get into changing some of those options. You can see on this slide here, we have listed a couple of other items like graphics and CPU. It's important to recognize the hardware components that you have available on your computer. Graphics processing and the computing power of your CPU are definitely factors in managing your PhotoView 360 renderings. The more computing power that you have for each one of these components, the quicker that you can create those rendered images. If you need more information about requirements for PhotoView 360 or other SolidWorks products, feel free to check out solidworks.com and take a look at the system requirements for more information there. What I'd like to take a look at are some examples of how to manage a few of those settings to help you get your rendered images as quickly as possible. Let's go back to our SolidWorks assembly. And in this case, we're just going to experiment with a couple of different options here. So we'll start first by discussing one of the items on my list, and that's using named views. This is something that's really beneficial, especially if you have changes to make to your design. Just by hitting the space bar here, you can access any view orientation, including named views. For instance, I have one here called Render. This is going to assist me anytime I need to change my design. I can always come back to the same position that I used for the original rendering that I created. We're going to go ahead and set up another one of those views here in a moment, but that helps me to get exactly the view that I'm looking for in my final rendered image. Let's talk next about using some of the visual properties like real view graphics, shadows, ambient occlusion, and perspective. These are all options that you can experiment with, turning on and off to help you get the realism that you need for your final rendered images. It's really going to help to visualize some of those changes. So I recommend turning most of these options on before you create your rendered image. We're also going to experiment with some different backgrounds here. You can see that I've got quite a bit to choose from here in my list in SolidWorks 2015. Since 2015, you have the ability to manage your favorites for each of these environments. You can see that there's quite a list to choose from for different environments you can apply to your SolidWorks assembly. I've got a few of them enabled here. Anything that's checked in that list is going to show up in the user interface on your heads-up toolbar. So I'll just choose one that I know I want to use in this case. We've got a little footbridge, and we're going to place this quadcopter so that it appears that it's kind of flying over the footbridge. So I'll just get it close to where I want. You can see that our floor shadows show up here in the environment to help us get a nice realistic looking image. And we'll make some adjustments to that as we kind of go along here. That being said, I like the placement of where this assembly is located, so I'm going to go ahead and create another saved or named view here. Just click the named view icon to save a new view, and we'll call this one Render Bridge, so I know exactly what I get when I click on that view orientation. Now from this, let's take a quick look at applying some different visual properties. So for example, I can edit my scene properties, and under the lighting conditions for PhotoView 360, I can enable the accurate environment lighting. Now this takes a bit more processing power, but what it will do is apply lighting conditions pulled directly from the image that I've applied for my background. So it gives me a much more realistic environment lighting based on the images I've applied. We'll take a look next at applying some of the shadows in our environment. For example, if I wanted to align my shadows with a particular piece of geometry, I can make those selections. I can choose an offset value to say, where do I want that shadow located? And you can just make some quick adjustments to this to help you get the shadow effects that you want. We're going to go ahead and jump back to our rendered bridge view that we just created. And I'm also going to enable some of the functionality to turn on these directional lights. And these are created by default when you enable a different environment in SolidWorks. You'll have different directional lights that may be on or off depending on which one you choose. And you can always come back and add your own lights if you wanted to do that. In this particular case, I'm going to use a couple of options together to help me figure out if I want to use those lights or not. What we're most concerned about is our final rendered image. In order to get some updated renderings pretty quickly, you can use the render region inside SolidWorks with your integrated preview to help you gain a quick snapshot of what your final rendered image would look like. Rather than rendering the entire screen, it's just going to render anything inside that render region. So that's another shortcut I like to use so I don't have to spend too much time waiting to update that rendered image. So you can take advantage of that. Once you've turned on the render region, you can choose whether or not you want to use some of these directional lights in PhotoView 360. So I'll go ahead and turn these on, and you can see that my image will update inside the render region to include those new lighting effects. Once I'm happy with the results, I can go ahead and turn off my preview, turn off the render region if I like, and then I can go through and specify the options that I want for exporting my new rendered image. So as you can see here, there are different quality settings for the rendered images. You can change your output image resolution settings and so forth. There's a lot to choose from here. I won't get into every detail with those, but once we're ready to go and we've set all those final render settings, all we have to do at this point is click to create our final render. The last thing I'll do before I do that, we do have to change a couple of properties for the appearance of a couple of these parts. Now in this particular case, I want to change the hub section of this propeller to match the appearance on the outside of this motor. I can do that simply by copying and pasting the existing appearance from that motor. I'm going to copy the appearance from the face that I've chosen, and I'm going to paste it onto a face of that propeller hub. So we'll just choose paste here, and I'm going to apply it to that selected face. Now you'll notice when you paste these different appearances, you have the ability to place them in different locations. For example, at the part level, you can apply it to individual bodies or features or faces, whatever makes the most sense to you. But this really helps me to place those appearances very, very quickly without having to do multiple repetitive steps. So the appearances are set the way I like, and I'm ready to create my final rendered image. Now as you do this, a couple of things to keep in mind. You're going to get a preview window that shows up to help you get a quick glimpse of what your final rendered image will look like. You'll also notice that there are some squares that show up on the rendered image. These are directly correlated to the number of processor cores that you have available on your computer. The machine that I'm using has a Core i7 processor, so we see 8 squares that show up. It is a quad core with hyper-threading technology, so it's an 8-core processor. Like I mentioned before, the more cores you have available, the quicker the processing is going to go for creating your final rendered image. Now I've already got some images that I've created ahead of time, so we'll go ahead and abort the rendering for now. But one thing to keep in mind, you do have some additional post-processing options for changing colors, lighting filters, etc. If you'd like to explore some of those, you have quite a bit of options to choose from in PhotoView 360. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about how to move forward efficiently with creating some of those rendered images. Just to recap, I'll show you some examples of images that I've already set up, including some that have come from our customer base. So by experimenting with those different background and lighting and material appearance conditions, you can really get some nice images out of it pretty quickly, depending on the level of detail that you want to apply to these images. So I've done a couple with different backgrounds. Here's one similar to what we just set up with the footbridge. And here's one that has a pretty high level of detail. This comes from one of our customers, Novatech. They went through and applied multiple different appearances to many different parts, different lighting conditions. Really, there's a lot incorporated here from the PhotoView 360 options to make a really nice, professional-looking rendered image. That about does it for the session on technical documentation and communication. I appreciate you watching the Tech Day 2015 sessions. If you do have questions about any of the options that you've seen today or in any of our other web sessions, feel free to give us a call at the number listed on screen or send us an email to support@qintegration.com. This is Brandon Adkins. Thanks again for watching.